Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to be looking at figures of speech in our continuing study of the poetic books of the Old Testament. There's a word that we don't use very often. It's called a trope, and it's just another way of speaking of a figure of speech. That is a literary device that uses words in other than their normal sense of the term. Actually, the word trope, like I said, we don't use it very much, probably because it came from the Latin word tropus, refers to a manner or style. And so it's a manneristic or stylistic way of speaking as we describe something, and yet we're using words other than the way we would normally literally take them. The first type of trope is a simile. A simile, for example, the Psalm chapter 1 verse 3, where it says, "He will be like a tree firmly planted by streams of water." A simile is pretty easy to tell. You just look for the word like. He is like that. We try to be like Christ. That doesn't mean we become Christ. We try to emulate him. We try to be like him in certain ways. And so likewise, the one who is seeking to follow the Lord, who walks in his path, he's going to be like a tree. That doesn't mean he has roots or leaves or branches or anything like that, but in the sense that you put a tree that's planted by streams of water, it's nourished. So likewise, the person who is following the Lord, walking in the way he should go, walking in the way of the Lord, he's also going to be well planted in where he finds himself. That's a simile. That psalm goes on to say in the next verse, "The wicked are not so. They are like something else. They are like chaff, which the wind drives away." Chaff is that you take grain and you once you cut it down, you gather it together, and then you grind the grain, and it breaks the hard kernel on the outside. The husk surrounds the kernel that you want to keep, and you take that outer husk and you throw that away. Well, the wicked are like chaff. Again, they're not a hard husk, but they are like that, in which they're sort of useless. They're going to be driven away by the wind. Our next figure of speech is a metaphor. Now, a metaphor is like a simile, except you take away the word like. So notice, I could have said, the Lord is like a rock. He is like a fortress, but it's much stronger when I say, the Lord is my rock. And that doesn't mean he's made of granite or anything. It means that he's immovable. He's big and he's strong and he doesn't move easily, and he's a place of refuge. So the Lord is my rock. The Lord is my fortress. The Lord is my deliverer. And those, especially rock and fortress, those are very physical things. Deliverer, not so much. But with rock and fortress, that's a metaphor, because you could have said he's like a fortress, he's like a rock, but instead you're saying he is that. And so that's a figure of speech, a metaphor. That psalm goes on to say, "My shield and the my shield and the horn of my salvation. He is my stronghold." And so again, you could have said he's like a shield, he's like a horn, he's like a stronghold, but the Lord is those things. And so that's much more concrete as we use that metaphor. The next figure of speech is called metonymy. It's the use of the name of one thing to stand for another. For example, we talk about how, I opened the newspaper today and talked about the White House says, and actually the White House didn't say anything. It's just a building. Buildings don't talk. But what you're saying is the people whoever's running the White House, that person said, or the group of people that represent the president, they came out with a public statement. And so you're using one thing to stand for another. In that case, I was using the term White House to stand for something else. Psalm chapter 3 verse 3, "But you, O Lord, are a shield about me." Now that's a little bit like metaphor, but notice the next line, "You're my glory and the one who," and here it is, "lifts my head." Now that doesn't mean that he removes my head from my shoulders, or even that he elongates my neck, but rather he lifts me up, he encourages me, he lifts my spirits, and my head speaks of the rest of me. It speaks of my sort of emotional and spiritual well-being. And that's what's happening here. Here's another one, Psalm chapter 40 and verse 6. Sacrifice and meal offering you have not desired. My ears you have opened. Burnt offering and sin offering you have not required. Notice that phrase, my ears you have opened. That doesn't mean that my ears were plugged up before. What it does mean is that you're doing something special, that you're capturing my attention. You're catching me. Now it's interesting that Hebrews chapter 10 verse 5, in quoting that passage, and he starts off, sacrifice and meal offering you have not desired, he renders that, the meaning behind that metonymy, a body you have prepared. You're doing something special here, Lord. You're preparing a body. And of course, the writer of the Hebrews takes that and applies it to Jesus. And that's an understanding of the metonymy that takes place behind the literal reading of the passage. Next we have irony. Now irony is the use of a word designed to convey the opposite of its normal meaning. You say, you tell somebody, oh man, she's beautiful. Yeah, right. Well, not really. And so irony, you're saying one thing and what you mean is the exact opposite. Job, for example, in Job chapter 12, verses 1 and 2, and he's just been speaking to his three friends, and they're giving all sorts of good advice. The problem is it doesn't apply to Job. We're going to talk about that later on. Well, Job responded, and he says to his friends, truly then you are the people, and with you wisdom will die. In other words, you know it all. Like, yeah, right. Not really. And so he's saying one thing, but he means its exact opposite. That's the use of irony. There are occasional uses of irony in the scriptures. Not a lot of them, but once in a while. Finally, there is personification. Personification is when you give human attributes, human personality, to inanimate objects. Psalm chapter 98 verse 8. Let the rivers clap their hands. Rivers don't have hands. Let the mountains sing together for joy. Mountains don't sing. Yes, I know the wind can, go through them and whistle and things like that, but that's not what it's talking about. What it's saying is that it's attributing human personality to these inanimate objects as a figure of speech. In other words, we're the ones that ought to be clapping our hands. We're the ones that ought to be singing for joy. And let all creation do that in how wonderful creation is, in what a great testimony it is to the Lord. This little cartoon I couldn't resist. I picked it up a while back. Here's a man speaking to his doctor, and he's got a knife sticking out of his back, and the caption goes, good news, the test results show that it's a metaphor. In other words, you don't really have a knife sticking in your back. Somebody backstabbed you. We have that English expression, he was stabbed in the back. We don't mean that literally, we mean that figuratively. Somebody came behind you and said something they shouldn't have said about you. And so even in our culture, we use these sorts of figures of speech. Hope that helps.